Good evening. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Jonathan. I am the host of the podcast called Masculinity Uncovered. I change the thesis of the podcast all the time, but overall, the idea behind the podcast is to uncover conversations that are kind of difficult to have, either because of societal, cultural sensitivities, or frankly, nobody cares because we're men. But besides the point. So today I had a first guest on my podcast. I have it on my channel with a gentleman named Matthew Lohmann. I think he is one of the few remaining people who are sane in that sense. He can discern between, you could say, fake and more on realistic perspectives. But one thing I did notice about throughout the conversation is he does come from an older world, so I have to respect his perspective in that sense. And one thing we kept clashing about, and if you could call it clashing, is because he comes from an older world, his observation is purely what he sees, right? I don't think he really can ascertain that the internet is basically where you can gather the most accurate data for things. I think if you go outside and do a bunch of surveys, you can definitely gather statistics, but realistically speaking, if you really want to gather data, the internet is your best friend. The other thing that he kept pointing out also is that people can talk crazy shit, but act completely different on the outside. And while I think that is a valid point, I think it is more true often than not that people are being completely honest on the internet. Whatever you see is what they are, If they show you who they are, believe them, kind of idea. I wasn't able to get all the answers to the question I was trying to ask. We kind of went down different rabbit holes and exploring different ideas, but one of the big topics that I was trying to hit on the head was, if society has certain duties and responsibilities for men, and specifically the case for protection and provisioning, there has to be an equivalent duty and responsibility from the woman's perspective. And I think it is very easy to say, well, family and children, and that is true, right? I think that is the equivalent for the ultimate sacrifice for men. The ultimate sacrifice for women would be a family, children, stable family. But the real question then becomes, if women refuse to fulfill their duties and responsibilities, then do men refuse their duties and responsibilities for society? And the answer should be yes. Because you cannot expect one party to abandon their duties and responsibilities and then expect the other party to fulfill them because we say so, right? So that's why if you listen to the 2.5 hour interview, guest, I guess, 2.5 time that I spent with the gentleman Matthew, one thing that I kept asking is that we basically would have to choose between absolute personal freedom and duties and responsibilities, because at some point, if you decide that what you want is absolute freedom, you basically cannot have any duties and responsibilities, or vice versa, because at some point they clash, meaning you cannot have the freedom to do things if you have a duty to do certain things, because when you have duties, it's not about you anymore. And if we're talking about personal freedom, it is absent duty. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, are there qualifiers to say that they both cannot, coalesce together? I think that's possible. I cannot think of it in the top of my mind right now, but as a general rule, when you have a duty to fulfill, there's no such thing as personal freedom at all, right? Freedom does involve responsibility, but the problem is that if you as a person pursue the path of freedom, normally you don't really think about what responsibilities those freedoms entail. A good example of this is you have the freedom to pursue a career. And while there is a responsibility of following through with your freedom, there is no responsibility on having a positive outcome, right? So if the positive outcome is that you graduate from college, then I am guessing that you could call that a responsibility. But in fairness, I don't think anybody can think of, hey, if I want to pursue freedom, that means you have assigned duties and responsibilities associated with that freedom. I don't think that's the case. May I be wrong? Sure. Maybe I'm going in a tangent, but I'm also hoping that people can understand what I'm trying to say. The other thing that I kept kind of going in circles about is, and unfortunately I wasn't able to ask you, so this was kind of all in my head, was that what is the point, of society if we have absolute freedom, personal freedom, and we don't have duties, or vice versa, right? What is the point of having duties and responsibilities if there is no freedom? And I think the only logical conclusion that I can draw from that is duties and responsibilities lead to a functioning society. Personal freedom doesn't. I think that may also tie into the topic of, if we care more about ourselves, can we actually build a society? Or is it all about the selfless acts of creating something, a family, a legacy? So it makes me wonder back into that discussion about duties and responsibilities versus freedom. If we as Americans want to pursue freedom, isn't the risk too high to abdicate our duties as citizens? Do we not have a duty to have families? Or does it really matter if we don't have families? Because we can't have both. We are either pro having families or we're not. There's no in between. Because if you say, well, people can choose what they want, technically, if you give that authority to everybody, the reality is it's going to be a selfish pursuit. We're going to think about what benefits me. And from a societal perspective, the self is actually the worst thing that can happen. I'm not saying communism got that right, but the point is, when a society works together, they create larger and better things. There's something to gain from public doing, right? They care about, the idea is that they care about their fellow citizen. They want to see them thrive. And I think a good example of this is the Amish. They always help each other in times of disaster. So I think there is a deeper conversation that I need to have about this topic, about personal freedom and duties and responsibilities. I personally